First of all, let's have a sort of quick think about the draft text from Rio+20, which is probably going to be stamped by all the world leaders. Probably they'll be patting themselves on the back and telling them well done. How would you reflect on the past 2 weeks?
I think the discussion has been excellent and identified a number of issues that are key to sustainable development and improving the quality of lives around the world. I think the discussions have been very high level, and we need to drill down to some of the practical approaches that will work for especially developing countries, transitioning countries, for improving lives in those countries, as well as what the developed world can do better to improve sustainable development.
You've said the discussions have been excellent. You're probably the first person I've heard who said that, and many people I've spoken to would say, "Is this guy living on another planet? What do you mean the discussions have been excellent?" How would you explain the way you've said that? I mean, what part of them have been excellent?
Well, this conference has been so large that I've only been able to participate in a certain segment of it. But for instance, the discussions yesterday about fossil fuel subsidies and tax policy and how that influences the use of fossil fuels is key. Going back to what I said, though, we need to drill down beyond, we know that tax policy needs to be reformed. What are some of the practical approaches for improving the tax code in various countries to avoid these types of direct and indirect subsidies? So I understand why some people have criticized the conference because some of these issues are too high level, maybe too academic would be a word for it. And I think it would be useful for future conferences for the organizers to invite more practitioners. And our organization is a practitioner in these areas, so people who've actually drafted energy tax codes, people who have advised governments on how to do social marketing so that the poor do not riot when gas prices go up, and to explain to them that, for instance, it's actually the rich who are benefiting from these lopsided subsidies and tax codes. So that's one example.
In terms of these conferences, even if we had an amazing text, the question always comes back to implementation, and clearly you need domestic political support for that. You're based in Washington. I imagine that you do meet with politicians on a fairly regular basis. How do we get past this stage of text and actually get down to the implementation stage?
Well, I think it's difficult to generalize on that type of question. Each country has its own circumstances. In the U.S., we do have indirect subsidies through the tax code, for instance, for oil companies. But what I found from working overseas, primarily in Africa, it's a matter of also educating the populace as to why these changes need to take place, how it will benefit them, and also being realistic about, with any type of change, there's usually, if it's a good change, there's some type of pain that will go along with it, and educating the population as to what that pain will be, why it's coming about, and also looking at ways that the pain can be mitigated for especially the most vulnerable part of the population.
Nigeria is a great example. Goodluck Jonathan attempted, he was widely praised for cutting fossil fuel subsidies, oil subsidies, and it ended in chaos. What can we learn from that experience?
Nigeria is a very good case study, as you mentioned, and I think it was probably too quick. Nigeria has been working on their petroleum industry bill for a long time, have not been able to pass it. So it's not only the aspects of doing away with the fuel subsidies in Nigeria, it's also an issue of reforming the benefits that the country gets from the offlift of the oil. So this needs to be combined together in a country like Nigeria, or Angola is another good example where there's high fuel subsidies. And it also, I didn't at least see much public education in Nigeria about why fuel prices were going up, and there was no frank discussion as to who was really benefiting from these oil subsidies.
You're here on the stage, you're communicating. How would you assess the communication in this particular sector? I know you said earlier it's hard to generalize, and absolutely, but how would you generally assess the communication of sustainable development messages, be they fossil fuel subsidies, be they other forms of tax relief, or the way we tax certain products or incentivize certain products like wind power? How would you assess the way these are being communicated?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that are unknown, and it depends who your audience is, really, as to how you want to frame the communication. I think here at this conference, there's been sessions where there's been very good discussion and the audience has been able to participate. And then there's been other sessions, unfortunately, where there's been no time for questions and answers and comments and the really sharing of information. And I think that, yesterday I sat in a presentation where Croatia has made great strides in the area of energy efficiency, and it would be very useful to have more sessions where countries are sharing their experiences, both experience that has worked and that which has not worked. So I recommend to the organizers to consider that for the future.
And as I said before, you're based in Washington. Is there enough listening from the hugely developed countries? Do they listen enough to developing countries? We've been hearing a lot in the past 2 weeks on this stage about how indigenous policies can work well, in tandem with other projects. How would you assess that kind of the feedback process that's going on?
I think with the developed countries, the issue has been the financial crisis, of course, which has really tamped down some of the efforts, for instance, in renewable energy. The United States, for instance, the economic crisis has definitely been a part of the lack of a carbon market and a carbon law. But also countries, for instance, the United States, I believe countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, have discovered a great deal of shale gas. And that's also contributing to tamping down renewables. Renewables are expensive, and we have to be realistic about that. And somebody has to pay for it. Ultimately, it will be the consumer who pays for renewable. And with the price of gas right now, at least in the United States, it's very difficult for renewables to compete, and they need subsidies. Subsidies are always a two-edged sword. They can be very good or very bad for the economy. And I think that we need to be realistic. There's some academics who say subsidies are bad, 100%. I would disagree with that. I would say subsidies can be good, but they need to be rational and transparent so that we all understand why and how the subsidies are working and understand the complications of who's benefiting from those subsidies. So I think there's many things going on in the developed world. I hope that the situation will improve as our economies improve and get back on track.
And a final point, picking up on what you said about subsidies, at the start of this week there was a big move by some of the NGOs to end fossil fuel subsidies. They created what they called a Twitter storm, and there was tremendous pressure from their point of view on trying to convince governments to all sign up to these measures. But given what we talked about Nigeria, and given the reliance on fossil fuels in many developing countries, is there a danger that we become a bit too ambitious, and when those great aims and ideals we go for fail, we end up sort of walking out of these conferences in a bit of a huff? Is there more need for sort of smaller steps?
I would agree 100% with you that we have to have a gradual plan. Any effort to completely remove subsidies or rip the Band-Aid off, so to speak, will end in chaos and disaster. And I think that if we're going to have a real discussion with our political leaders, we need to understand their political constraints and what pressures they face from their electorate.